Okay, it is 3:01, and since we are hosting this from Switzerland, we are bound to start very much on time, which is why I'm going to do this now. Welcome to you, welcome to the audience, welcome to our workshop series on algorithmic market activity and competition law and IT and economics. As you know, this workshop series is organized by University of Zurich's CIPCO in cooperation with the Swiss Competition Authority and ASCOLA, the Academic Society for Competition Law. Today's session focuses on the econ and IT aspects of the topic. How do firms like Amazon program and use algos for their business practices? What is the state of the econ discourse on algorithmic pricing? What does cutting-edge research tell us about the effects of algos becoming ever smarter, moving towards maybe even a state of so-called artificial intelligence? I'm very happy that we can address these and further topics today with three top experts in the field. Christo Wilson is a professor at Northeastern University, Boston, and a faculty associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center. Having authored several award-winning papers on the matter, he will introduce us to the IT and empirical perspective. Joe Harrington is a professor and the chair of the economics department at the University of Pennsylvania. Very recently, he co-published a much-noticed paper on protecting consumers from collusive prices due to AI. Today, he will give us the broader picture of Econ research on algorithmic pricing. And last, but in no way least, we have Giacomo Calzolari with us. Giacomo is a professor of economics at the European University Institute and a member of DG Comp's experts group. As you know, he co-authored the pioneering paper on algorithmic price collusion in experimental settings. Giacomo will tell us today about the impact of artificial intelligence on algorithmic pricing and collusion. You see, we have a very rich agenda, which is why I cut my introduction short now. Before giving the word to Christo Wilson, though, two admin remarks. There will be ample time for discussion after the presentations of our three speakers. So there will be one long Q&A session at the end of this session. The Q&A will be hosted by my CIPCO colleague, Professor Adrian Künzler. Hi, Adrian. Very good you're with us today, and thank you for co-hosting. You as the audience are very much invited to ask questions and contribute to the discussion. Best would probably be if you flag in the Zoom chat that you have a question. You no need to post the question in full. I always like it better if people ask their questions personally instead of me having read them out to the speakers, but if you prefer to just post the text, fine as well. And you can also raise your digital Zoom hand during the Q&A session if you prefer that. I'll very much try to take notice of all interventions and questions, and forgive me if I overlook something. With that, I would say we have so much to talk about. Let's fire away. Christo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share slides. How's that? People can see the slides. Excellent.
Very good.
So thank you, Peter, very much for having me here. It's a pleasure speaking to you all today. So I am Christo Wilson. I'm a computer scientist from Northeastern University in Boston. My research interests are fairly broad. I do a lot of work on online tracking and privacy, but my other major research thrust is this thing that we call algorithm auditing. So in case that's not a term that you've ever heard of, algorithm auditing focuses on trying to understand essentially the algorithms that shape our world. So when we're talking about big online platforms, what is the data that they're collecting from us? And then how do their algorithms use that data to shape our experience? So to give you a flavor of this work, we've done algorithm audits in the past focused on things like filter bubbles and political echo chambers, primarily on Google search and now YouTube. Some of our work is focused on classic, unfair discrimination and bias, particularly in hiring situations. So this is on gig economy platforms, as well as things like resume search engines. Some of our work is also focused on markets. So we've looked at things like price personalization or price discrimination on major e-commerce sites. We've also done a lot of work on the surge pricing algorithms used by ride-sharing firms like Uber and Lyft. But today, what I want to talk about is Amazon. So in 2016, we did a study looking at Amazon Marketplace. And Amazon is just chock full of different algorithmic systems that try to shape the customer's experience and merchant's experience for that matter, and steer their behavior in a variety of ways. So Amazon is extremely complex, but for this study in particular, what we were primarily interested in was dynamic pricing as used by sellers in the marketplace. So Amazon is a true marketplace in the sense that anyone can join and sell products. And not only can you, list a product for sale, but you can also list products that other people are selling, right, and compete directly against them. So here's an example of an iPhone case. And if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, there's this little teeny box that maybe you've never even noticed before that says that there are multiple offers available for this product, right? So there's multiple merchants who are selling this iPhone case. And they're free to change their prices, adjust their inventory, do whatever they want. And Amazon actually provides tools for this. They provide APIs that will send pricing data to merchants so that they can dynamically adjust their own prices for the items they offer on the fly. So we were very interested in whether merchants were engaged in dynamic pricing, and if so, what were the kind of characteristics of that behavior? But looking at dynamic pricing on Amazon is complex because of a second factor, which is the buy box, right? So when you go to Amazon, you typically only encounter an offer from one merchant, right? Everything about the design of this page says this iPhone case costs $13.99. And if you click that buy button on the right, one of the merchants is going to make the sale to you. So this is the buy box algorithm's job. This is an algorithm that determines amongst the sellers who are offering a particular product, which one is currently going to be actually making the offers on the main page. So the buy box algorithm is incredibly important. We don't know exactly how important, but anecdotal evidence suggests that upwards of 80% of all sales on Amazon go through the merchant that's been highlighted in the buy box. Right? People just click the buy now button, which makes sense. Right? Everything about the design of the site discourages exploration. Very few people are going to go and click that tiny box in the bottom right to look at the other offers. So this complicated our study. Right? We wanted to understand dynamic pricing among merchants, but that also means we need to understand the buy box, because the merchants aren't just competing with each other, they're competing with the algorithm to be highlighted on the page. So I'll tell you a little bit about the study and the things we found. As far as I know, this is still one of the first and only studies that really presents a comprehensive picture of merchant dynamics on Amazon Marketplace. I'll show you how we used statistical tests and machine learning to actually infer things about the buy box algorithm and how it works and the data it uses. We developed some cute techniques to try and identify merchants that were engaged in dynamic pricing. And I'll give you some facts about those merchants, so how they behave in the marketplace and how they kind of affect the overall dynamics. So I'll very briefly tell you about the data that we collected for our study. I'll present some of the key findings about the buy box and about dynamic pricing by merchants. And then I'll give you some of the takeaways that I think are sort of important to highlight from this study and to help kick off our discussion today. So in terms of data collection, we did 2 crawls of top selling products on Amazon. So what this means is that we had an automated web browser that was periodically visiting about 1,000 products on Amazon, roughly every 25 minutes. And every time our crawler visited these products, it would download the main page, so the one with all the product information, and then it would go and also crawl the pages showing all the other offers for those items from other merchants. So to give you a picture of kind of the data that we can get when we collect all these web pages, right? Here's a Breville juicer. Right, so from the main page, we get things like the star rating and the rating count, right? How many reviews has this product received? And obviously we're getting price as well. This also tells us things like, is the merchant offering free shipping? And are they a member of Amazon's fulfillment program? Do they offer prime shipping? Right, we get everything in the buy box, so all the shipping details, fulfillment by Amazon, prime eligibility. And then we get all this information again from all of the merchants that are making this particular product available for sale. Right, so if there's 50 of them, right, we'll see all 50 offers from all these merchants. So let's dig into some of the analysis. What can we learn from this fairly large scale longitudinal data set? So in terms of the overall dynamics of the products we were observing, so this plot is showing the number of changes in the buy box that we observed over time. And this is both looking at the number of changes in price for the items, as well as the number of times the seller changed, right? So the offer switched from one merchant to another. So right off the bat, we're seeing that 50% of these items we were watching exhibited significant dynamics, right? The price or the seller was changing fairly frequently. So we're seeing, again, right off the bat, that there's a fair amount of dynamics in the marketplace here. Even keeping the set of products static, prices and the offers are actually changing a lot. So what can we infer about the behavior of the buy box algorithm? So we used two different approaches to go at this. One is that we trained a machine learning classifier, a decision tree, to try and predict what the buy box would do. We also used standard regression techniques. So what we're seeing here are the different variables that we looked at and their significance to the algorithm. So the variable that seems to matter most is low price. And that makes sense, right? Amazon is all about low prices for customers. And indeed, it seems that the buy box seems to favor the offers that have lower prices. The other thing that seems to really matter is the positive feedback percentage for merchants. So if you have a more positive feedback than one of your competitors, even if your price is the same, right, the one with the better feedback is likely to be selected and favored for the buy box. And again, that makes sense. If you're trying to offer good customer service, it probably makes sense to favor the merchants who appear to be offering that level of service. So one thing that has a little bit of a strange behavior is fulfillment by Amazon. So the logistic regression tells us that this variable actually was highly significant, but it had low discriminative power. So what this essentially is telling us is that, yes, being a member of Amazon Fulfillment does confer an advantage in the buy box, but all of the competitive merchants are already using Fulfillment by Amazon. So it actually doesn't end up mattering, and things like price or feedback end up mattering more. So one interesting feature to think about is we added a binary variable to the decision tree, basically asking, is this merchant Amazon? And that variable did receive some weight in the model. So does this suggest that Amazon has rigged the marketplace in their own favor, right? When they offer a particular item, they confer an advantage to themselves. I don't actually think that's true. And the reason I don't think that is because there's a bunch of unobserved confounding variables that might play into this calculation. So Amazon says things like, the speed at which you respond to customer requests might impact your buy box placement, or your return rate might impact buy box placement. We can't measure those variables, right? Those aren't visible in the public facing marketplace. And it may very well be that Amazon is very good on those unobserved metrics, which would explain why they appear to be getting an advantage in the marketplace. So what about the behavior of all these merchants with respect to dynamic pricing? So we used a bunch of time series analysis to look for cases where merchants had prices that were moving in lockstep to a variety of different pegs, right? So were they pegged to the lowest price over time or the second lowest price, or were they pegged to Amazon's price, either at a fixed dollar amount or at a fixed percentage? So these are some of the cases that we found where it's very obvious that someone is using a dynamic pricing algorithm. So these are both time series, where we're seeing time on the x-axis, price on the y-axis for two different items. And in both examples, the seller that we've marked in red is using a dynamic pricing algorithm. So you see in both of these cases, the seller in red is always moving very close to the other sellers, right? Even when this other sellers change, right? You see a shift where there's a purple seller and then they actually disappear from the marketplace, right? They pulled their inventory, or maybe they sold out. And then immediately, the red seller adjusts their price to match a new seller that enters the market. Here's a few more examples, and these are slightly different because in these cases, the seller in red that's using dynamic pricing is Amazon itself. Right? So these are products where Amazon also offers the item. Now, these are a little bit interesting because what we see is that Amazon is typically offering a higher price than other competing merchants. This was very much a theme in some of our results, that Amazon themselves, they typically don't offer the lowest price amongst all of the competing merchants, and yet they almost always secure the buy box placement if they're in the market for a particular item. This is also true to some extent for other sellers in the marketplace as well. So I can give you some of the things we learned about sellers in the market that use dynamic pricing. So one interesting thing is that they tend to offer fewer products overall than other merchants that are not using dynamic pricing. But the products that they do offer tend to be available for longer periods of time. So this suggests that the sellers that are using dynamic pricing have a deeper commitment to the products they're making available, and they have a larger inventory. This is especially true because another thing we saw was that although the algorithmic sellers tend to have slightly more positive feedback overall, so a slightly greater star rating, they also have a much larger amount of feedback in total, right? So the number of reviews they accrue is much larger than sellers that don't use dynamic pricing. So this is a suggestion that the sellers involved with dynamic pricing are making more sales overall, right? The best way to accrue feedback is to sell more items. So the final and probably most important thing that we observe is that the sellers that are using dynamic pricing have an overwhelming advantage with respect to the buy box. They tend to be the ones who secure buy box placement. So we see that there's sort of a positive feedback cycle happening here. You use dynamic pricing, that enables you to secure the buy box. Because you've secured the buy box, you sell more items, right? That's the primary way that people purchase things on Amazon. Because you sell more items, you get more feedback, which is then a variable that affects future buy box placement, right? Making it more likely that you'll continue to have buy box placement in the future. So here's a couple more fun facts. So the plot on the left is showing the change in price in terms of percent versus different offers. So the blue line is for sellers that are engaged in dynamic pricing, what their price is relative to the lowest offer. And the red line is relative to Amazon's offer for items. So one of the things that we see here is that if we compare the sellers using dynamic pricing to Amazon, we see that their prices tend to be higher, right? The percentages are all positive. And that makes sense given Amazon's fee structure, right? If Amazon offers a product for $10, that suggests that's probably the wholesale price or close to it. If everyone else is also getting that product for $10 at wholesale, but they have to pay Amazon's fees, right? Things for fulfillment by Amazon, plus Amazon takes about a 15% commission of all sales. Right? That suggests that everyone competing against Amazon is going to have a slightly higher price overall. So the plot on the right is looking at the number of changes in buy box over time, stratified by non-algorithmic cases where the product did not have anyone using dynamic pricing, and those are in blue, versus cases where at least one of the merchants was using dynamic pricing, and those are in red. So what we're seeing over here is that in cases where there's at least one merchant using dynamic pricing, as we'd expect, the way that product behaves is far more dynamic. There's a lot more changes in price. There's a lot more changes in the occupant of the buy box. So in other words, because there is dynamic pricing in Amazon Marketplace, that leads to a customer experience where who is offering items and the prices of items are constantly fluctuating. So a couple of takeaways. Just to summarize the work, this is one of the first studies that really took an empirical lens to these kinds of dynamics on Amazon Marketplace. We were able to learn certain things about the buy box algorithm. So we found that price is most important, but also that things like positive feedback and fulfillment by Amazon do matter. And what ultimately this ends up meaning is that merchants that have a lot of feedback and positive feedback can actually charge a price premium. They can offer things at higher prices than their competitors, but they will still secure the buy box. So this is often surprising to people. People think that the lowest price, right, will always be the one in the buy box, but that's not always true. We also use time series analysis to look at different merchants. We're pretty successful at finding ones that are obviously using dynamic pricing. We can observe things that are sort of interesting about their behavior. So one thing I want to point out is that pricing is not the only way that Amazon Marketplace is dynamic. So if we're thinking about competition, just focusing on changes in price within a marketplace or between marketplaces is not really the end of the story. So if we're thinking about modern complex markets like Amazon, many of them engage in things that are personalized, right? So your experience of the market is not necessarily going to be the same as my experience of the market. And that opens a number of opportunities to shape customer behavior, some of which involve price, right? So it could be that there's price discrimination. And when I go look at these TVs, the prices I see are just different than the ones that you see. But there's other interventions, right? The way that these price changes are presented could be different, right? Maybe it's saying that I'm getting a discount when it's not offering you the same discount, right? Or alternatively, perhaps the order of the items is being personalized. So this is something we've seen in other markets, not Amazon, right? But this is another way to shape someone's behavior. Put the most expensive item or maybe the cheapest item at the top to encourage different purchasing patterns. Or alternatively, just show people different inventory. Right? This is something we've also seen in other marketplaces. You and I search for the same thing, but we just see completely different items, potentially at totally different price points, as again, a way of shaping our behavior. It's very hard for customers to know whether this is happening because, as an individual, I only have kind of my one window into these systems. But these are things that when we're thinking about, transparency and regulation, we should at least consider, right? And that price itself is not the be-all and end-all of digital market manipulation. There's other things we can potentially manipulate, right? Amazon has things like Amazon's Choice or labels like bestseller. Those are not necessarily objective labels, right? We can imagine that there's algorithms that could personalize those for different individuals as well. So just to conclude, I'll get on my soapbox a little bit and then I'll stop talking. So I would argue that algorithmic opacity is bad. We do see that Amazon has a pretty clear advantage when they offer items in their own market. That's perhaps not great, and it's not clear why. So this is an argument for increased transparency. If we're going to have a market maker also competing in their own market, it would be nice to know that they're at least competing fairly. I argue that dynamic pricing is adversarial to consumers. So if we think about like buying airline tickets and hotels online, that's typically a very stressful experience for people. You always feel like you're being cheated, right? Because the prices are changing all the time. Now that this is starting to happen in retail markets, I argue that we're moving into a situation where people are going to have the same anxiety about retail shopping, right? All of a sudden, you always feel like you're being ripped off because you buy the thing and then the next day the price goes down, which leads to a lot of regret. The other thing that is really important from our study is we pretty clearly see that these winner-take-all algorithms entrench power. So there's a pretty clear feedback loop going on here. A seller will enter the market for an item, offer it at a low price, perhaps an artificially low price, in order to capture the buy box. Once they have accrued feedback, they can then raise their prices above other competitors and yet still capture the buy box. And thus essentially box other competitors out of the market. The fact that this buy box algorithm is winner take all, and it's coupled with a website design that discourages price exploration is not great in my opinion. So I think we need to think about alternative designs for these markets or other mechanism designs that discourage this kind of winner take all effect. So the last point, and this is something I know we're going to hear more about soon, is the potential for algorithmic collusion. So we definitely see cases where there are multiple dynamic sellers for a given product, and they move in lockstep, right? They're pegged to one another's prices. This does not always lead to downward price exploration, right? In many cases, actually, I think in the majority of cases we saw, it actually led to upward exploration as they move up and up and up to their kind of ceiling. So even if this is not intentional, right, it is still arguably collusion, and it's anti-consumer in my opinion, because it's not pushing prices down. So with that, I will conclude. I'm looking forward to questions, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Christo. That was really, really most interesting. Not only learning about how these beasts work or apparently work from your experimental auditing, but also from a competition lawyer's perspective. It was really very good to have your kind of fresh look on whether what Amazon or the success Amazon is experiencing regarding the buy box is really due to kind of anti-competitive self-preferencing or more due to the fact that they can, that they are very successful in employing those tools and understanding how those tools work. And I think this is an aspect that could, add something to the European discussion, which is sometimes rather quick in assuming that there are plans for distorting competition going on. And also, of course, like the digital bubble building that you described is most interesting, and I think we'll be discussing that later on, just as the power entrenchment tending to increase prices you described in your presentation. So thank you very much. That was a fascinating introduction, but I realize I am so excited to talk too much, so I stop talking and hand over to Joe Harrington right away. Joe, you're one of the best experts in the Econ research on algorithmic pricing. So please educate us. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be invited and be able to speak with you all. I don't think there's anyone who's actually an expert yet on algorithmic pricing, because it's kind of a new area and it's developing almost as fast as we can try to understand it. To give you a kind of let you change gears a bit, we've just heard an excellent presentation by Christo on a very kind of drilled down, rigorous analysis of a particular aspect to algorithmic pricing. I'm going to give you more of a kind of a global view a little bit of background, and then an economist's kind of assessment of some of the incentive issues that come up in the context of algorithmic pricing, in particular, their relationship to issues in competition policy. Okay, so defining algorithmic pricing, it's a pretty broad concept. Basically, people can define it different ways, but one general way is that you're having computer programs set prices. Now, that can encompass a wide array of different types of pricing mechanisms, and they can go from simply putting in a particular pricing rule, programming it, and with regular intervention by a pricing manager, adjusting the coefficients to the pricing rule. That has occurred for decades. And then it can go all the way to the other extreme where there's very little human intervention. You have a self-learning algorithm which is selected by, let's say, the pricing manager. They put in the performance metric. That is, how does the self-learning algorithm evaluate a pricing algorithm in terms of performance, and then adjust it accordingly to try to achieve better performance. And we'll hear a bit about that when we get to Jacques's presentation. So there's a lot that comes underneath this rubric of algorithmic pricing. But just to give you kind of a flavor of what one has in mind here, you saw it very much in Christo's talk. Here, A2I Pricecast describes their pricing algorithm as it kind of utilizes learning algorithms to construct dynamic profiles of customers and their usage patterns, as well as competitors. These systems rapidly and intelligently react to changing customer behavior, changing markets, and unexpected events. So that encompasses a lot, and that's kind of like what the aspiration is, I would say, for algorithmic pricing. Now, you think about what kind of goes into algorithmic pricing. Well, there's economics and there's technology. Economics focuses on kind of the goals of agents and the incentives involved. Technology, I would say, focuses more on the constraints and implementation. And what we, with algorithmic pricing, we get prices which really are a confluence of those two forces. To give you kind of an example, take something like price discrimination, which is obviously a very important manifestation of algorithmic pricing that's been discussed a lot. Economics describes, how a firm should price discriminate to achieve an objective such as maximizing profits. And it shows how it depends on a customer's willingness to pay, the price elasticity of demand, how it depends on the substitutability with competitors' products, and so forth. Technology, in some sense, can be thought of as a means for implementing that price discrimination, by collecting data on consumers, using machine learning to identify key characteristics that go into the pricing algorithm, tracking competitors' prices, and doing this, in a very automated fashion so that prices can change in real time. Okay. So both of these things are kind of instrumental in terms of algorithmic pricing, and they aren't really necessarily so partitioned as I've presented here. I mean, technology can very much seep over into kind of the describing what really are the implementation of certain objectives. Once again, still kind of just giving more of a broad overview on what algorithmic pricing encompasses. And here you can think about it, and both these things came up in Christo's talk, that algorithmic pricing has implications on prices over time, and really as a cross-section. That is, it affects what's called dynamic pricing, in that we can have very rapid responses to changes in the firm's environment, such as demand, competitors' prices, inventories, and the like. And then at any moment in time, we can get variation in prices across buyers. And that could be just submarkets, or it could be really personalized prices dependent upon very specific information, such as past purchases and clickstream activity. It's natural to ask, why has algorithmic pricing become more common? As I said, it's actually been going on for decades. The airlines have been engaging in this for perhaps it's been as long as 50 years. And certainly advances in AI have contributed to it, but it's really about the data. It's about the fact that there's just so much more data, which makes kind of automated pricing more attractive relative to humans, pricing managers setting prices. We think about big data as meaning higher volume, higher variety, higher velocity, and all those things feed into why algorithmic pricing has become more common. So you have more data, it means pricing decisions can rely less on non-quantifiable information and more on the hard data. Because what used to be the case is the best information for pricing was inside a pricing manager's head. Okay? And that subjective assessments, well, that really pales in comparison to what now data can provide. On the velocity dimension, well, if we're getting more frequent information about cost, demand, and other inputs relevant to pricing, then we want to adjust price more frequently to take account of that information. And again, automated price setting becomes more attractive relative to price setting, which requires a lot of human input. And then when we get to self-learning algorithms, which actually will determine the pricing algorithm, then more data on the performance of any pricing algorithm will mean that those self-learning algorithms are more effective in terms of identifying better pricing rules. Now, in terms of where algorithmic pricing is occurring, it's occurring mostly in more retail markets and in particular types of retail markets. One is where demand fluctuates at much more rapidly than supply, such as airlines, ride hailing, and the like. And this makes it very useful to adjust price on a high frequency level so as to bring demand in line with supply. It's very common in areas where in markets where demand is very sensitive to price, such as retail gasoline, and as just pointed out, kind of Amazon Marketplace. Because in those instances, it's really critical for a firm to respond quickly to competitors' prices. It's very important in areas where the cost of providing some product or service varies across consumers. So think about, for example, the cost of providing insurance. Well, that depends on the likelihood of an individual making a claim, and the algorithm will do better, or let's say the firm will do better if they have a better estimate of the likelihood of that individual filing a claim. And machine learning can be very instrumental for coming up with those estimates, which are then fed into the pricing algorithm. And then finally, when you have a lot of products to be priced, it becomes much more effective to be able to do so in an automated fashion. Now, where algorithmic pricing is kind of less prevalent is in industrial markets. And there's at least a couple of reasons for that, and there's apt to be more. One is these purchases can be of larger magnitude, so that there's more of a tradition and an incentive to negotiate individual purchases. And secondly, an important piece of data is often not accessible, which is rivals prices. Because if prices are privately negotiated, then a firm is not going to know the prices that have been charged by the rival, or have very incomplete information. But even here, there's been an increasing use of algorithmic pricing. Once again, once we recognize that pricing is a combination of machines and humans. So for example, a distributor in the building material sector using machine learning to kind of estimate willingness to pay for their customers for each product. So that's very drilled down. And then their salespeople can use that information in negotiating. But certainly this is another avenue where there could be a significant increase in the role of algorithmic pricing. Now we know that there's lots of efficiencies from algorithmic pricing. Markets are going to clear faster as a result of that. I've already mentioned about the reduced cost of adjusting prices and of monitoring prices. It also it reduces the barriers to entry to a firm into a market, where traditionally a new firm would have to learn how best to price, and there would be a cost associated with that as they go down the learning curve. Well, now they may be able to just adopt pricing, well-developed pricing algorithms, potentially from a third party, and that will kind of reduce the kind of learning curve and reduce the cost to entry into a market. But there's also concerns about consumer harm. The personalized pricing is something that is generally going to transfer convert consumer surplus into firm or industry profit. On the other hand, there's reason to think that it's going to mean charging higher prices to high value consumers, potentially lower prices to low value consumers, and that might have some desirable distributional consequences. Christo mentioned at the end of his talk, and we'll hear more about this from Giacomo, that there could be reduced price competition because of the kind of quick monitoring and rapid price adjustments. And this could discourage price cuts and facilitate coordinated price increases. And then there's also potential for reduced price competition because the pricing decisions are being delegated to third parties. And I'll spend a fair amount of my time talking about this avenue, which I think is a very important one. It's a very important implication of algorithmic pricing. And it's one which poses a number of challenges from a competition policy perspective. So this is the outline for the remainder of my talk. Now, if we're interested in kind of looking at the effect of algorithmic pricing on market performance, on welfare, on what it means for competition policy, and you could look at it from really two perspectives. One, you can look at it from perspective of data, that is the data that goes into the algorithm, and you can look at the perspective from the design of the algorithm. I'm going to focus on the design, but there's a number of issues on data, for example, the exclusivity of data, third parties collecting data, whether they kind of generally share it or kind of have it sell it to one firm and so forth. There's issues about potential incumbency advantage coming from data and the like. So that's a whole other avenue, which is worthy of exploration, but I'm going to focus on the design. And I want to talk about how algorithmic pricing contributes to price leadership, looking at a particular study, and then look at this issue about third-party pricing in the context of platforms, where you literally delegate the price decision to a third party, and to where you outsource the pricing algorithm to a software developer. And then there's also the issue of collusion, which Giacomo will speak about after my talk. Okay, so let me start with this study here by Zach Brown and Alex McKay. And what they did was they were looking at the prices for over-the-counter allergy drugs for five top US online retailers. They had hourly price data over 6 months. And I want to point out two observations from their data. And we'll use those to derive a particular implication of algorithmic pricing. So the first observation is that the online retailers updated prices at regular intervals, but what that interval was varied significantly across the different retailers. So for example, we can see here, here we're reporting the percentage of products whose prices are changed on a given day, on average over the sample period. Retailer A, well, changed prices very frequently. 37% of the products had their price changed on average day. Retailer B, about 9%, and retailer C, D, and E changed prices fairly infrequently. To look at this in I think, a little bit more informative manner, here what we have is the average percent of price change products whose prices were changed over the week for retailers A, B, C, and D. E was similar to D. Retailer A, you can see, is changing prices, steadily over the course of the week. So is retailer B. Retailer C is basically changing prices between 3 and 6 a.m. on each day. And retailer D is just really changing prices kind of midnight on Sundays. So just changing prices weekly. So first observation, we see this variation across retailers. And as we'll see, this is not due to technology. This is a choice of the retailers. Second observation is that the firms who changed prices more frequently had lower prices. So if we look at this figure here, this is the median hours between price changes, and notice that the scale is inverse. So here we have the median time between price changes is 1 hour. Here it's 2 hours. Here it's once a day. Here it's once a week. And the vertical axis is the price index. And we can see here that retailer A, who's changing prices most frequently, basically once an hour, has the lowest prices. Retailer B, changing prices by basically every 2 hours, has the next highest prices. And you can see here that retailers D and E, who are basically just changing prices once a week, have significantly higher prices on the order of 28 to 33% higher. Okay, so what's the story to be told here? And the story to be told here is that these retailers have settled into a price leadership arrangement. if you're retailer D and E who are just changing prices once a week, you know that the other retailers are going to be responding to those prices because they're changing prices once a day or once an hour. So the retailers D and E are going to act like price leaders. And what that means is that they're going to tend to set higher prices than would occur under normal competition in order to induce A, B, and C, who are price followers, to raise their prices. So this both does two things. It explains why is it that the firms who change prices less frequently have higher prices, but it also has the implication that prices are higher on average overall than they would be under kind of normal competition. And so algorithmic pricing here has been very instrumental for achieving this price leadership arrangement because of the fact that it allows firms to kind of really select the frequency of their prices and furthermore allow them to commit to it. Okay, so there's one implication of algorithmic pricing, which is harmful to consumers. It creates an environment suitable for price leadership. So let me now turn to third-party pricing. And to me, this is one of the more interesting features of algorithmic pricing. Partly it's due to the fact that given that prices are now really being largely driven by data rather than internal information to a firm that's in a price manager's head, that means that pricing decisions can be outsourced because what goes into them, data, can be outsourced. But it also means that pricing algorithms can be outsourced as well. So maybe the data stays within the firm, but they rely on the pricing rule being developed by a third party. And so I think clearly this increased use of third parties for pricing has effects for competition, but what exactly those effects are is unclear. And in addition, it's unclear what really is the appropriate competition policy. So let's start by looking at platforms. So with platforms, we're familiar with them. We just saw one with Amazon Marketplace. The point I just want to kind of make here is that platforms vary in terms of how involved they get in the pricing process between buyers and sellers. So we know in the case of Uber, that Uber, the platform, sets the prices that drivers charge. With Airbnb, they do not set the prices that property owners charge, but they do recommend a price through their smart pricing algorithm. And then take TaskRabbit, who the platform doesn't get involved in pricing at all. So there's variation across platforms in terms of how involved they get in pricing. Now, let me just touch on one issue here, which raises a number of questions. And this issue came up in a piece of private litigation in the US in New York against Uber, Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber. And the plaintiffs in this case said that in their complaint that Mr. Kalanick had conspired with Uber drivers to use Uber's pricing algorithm and set the prices charged to Uber riders. So what's basically saying is that, well, they engaged in price fixing. They set the prices of competitors of the drivers. The Uber responded saying that in the contract, a driver shall always have the right to charge a fare that is less than the prearranged fare. And that is true. But then the plaintiffs also go on to say that that may be in the contract, but they provide no means by which the driver can really execute that feature. And in fact, the driver has no incentive to do so because once they've been pinged and they show up to a potential passenger, well, there's no reason to offer offer a lower price than what Uber has set. So this then raises the question of, well, should Uber be required to give pricing authority to its drivers? And some of the things that would go into that in terms of addressing that question would be, what is the market power of the platform? There is a competitor with Lyft. And secondly, technological feasibility. Okay. So let me kind of just, for the sake of time, just kind of briefly, kind of quickly go over this slide, which is say that it is technologically feasible to delegate some pricing authority to the drivers. There's a site, Lyft2Go, in the Czech Republic, which does exactly that. And as I said, for time, I won't go over the slide, but if you're interested, you can kind of go into the website. But this is certainly the relevant kind of issues one would want to bring to bear in deciding, well, what should be done in this case? Yeah. So these are some of the questions that it leads one to ask, which is, well, what should a platform be allowed to do in terms of the pricing interaction between the two sides of the platform? What role should they play? Should they be allowed to, for example, allow drivers or suppliers to delegate the authority to the platform, even if they don't mandate it? And if the platform does set prices, should there be any restrictions on the algorithm they use? And I like to pose this in terms of, suppose Airbnb all of a sudden decided to adopt Uber's approach to pricing, which is Airbnb will now set the prices of property owners. Is that a concern? Does it depend upon the objective of the algorithm that Airbnb uses? Suppose they have prices set to maximize the revenues of property owners in an area. I mean, does that create a concern? Should there be limitations on that? Would they even do so? Would that be in the best interest of the platform? Okay. And how does the interest of the platform really coincide with what are really kind of efficient outcomes in the market? So these are just some of the really open questions. Now, here I've been talking about the platform kind of setting prices and the potential implications of that. Let's think about now the sellers setting prices, but the platform can set rules on how those prices are set, or what the implications of those prices are. And you'll see what I'm about to talk about, some research, connects very nicely with Christo's discussion on the buy box. Okay. And so this is a recent paper by Justin Johnson and co-authors. And here, once again, I want to kind of present this to give you a flavor of what economists are starting to look at in terms of incentives. So here they're asking the question of, well, what kind of rules could be designed to promote competition and discourage collusion? And so one rule they considered, which is very much kind of motivated by the buy box, is what they call price-directed prominence. And just to say that, let's say we have end sellers, and the rule of the platform is the buyers only get to see the K sellers with the lowest prices, where K is less than N. So only the sellers with the lowest prices will be observed by the buyers. And an implication of that is that even if the sellers offer differentiated products, which we know under competition typically results in prices above cost, this platform rule would result in prices at cost, because it would create an environment where competition to be one of the select K would be so intense, it would drive prices down to cost. Okay. Now, there's a cost there from a consumer perspective. You are getting lower prices, but you're seeing fewer products. And when there's product variety, that's harmful. So there's a balancing there that has to be concerned. One has to be concerned with. In terms of trying to kind of stave off collusion, what they consider then is what's called a dynamic price-directed prominence rule, which says, okay, let's suppose now that the seller with the lowest price is the only one shown to buyers. Just consider that extreme case. And in addition, this seller is given an advantage for the future. That's where the dynamic comes in, which is that they will also be the only seller shown to buyers in the next period if it does not raise price and its price is not too much higher than that of other sellers. Now, what this does is it destabilizes any prospect for collusion. So, for example, there was a case with poster sellers where they coordinated on their pricing algorithms. This is prosecuted in the US and the UK. So think about that kind of collusive setting. What this type of platform rule would do, it would create such a powerful incentive to undercut the collusive price that it would destabilize collusion. And it does so because undercutting an agreed upon price doesn't just give you additional demand today, but gives you an advantage into the future because of the rule imposed by the platform. So let's now turn to delegating the price decision, where you just have a third party just make the price decision. So this has been examined in a recent paper in the context of sponsored search auctions. So you put a keyword into Google search engine, there's automatically an auction among potential advertisers to determine whose ads are placed before you. And so the issue here is what is the bid that an advertiser should set? That's a very specialized decision. Many companies have decided to outsource that bidding decision to a third party. So there's all sorts of, I just come down here to the efficiency rationale, there's all sorts of good reasons to allocate it to a third party. It's actually what's called a network, because they're going to have the expertise, the data, the incentives to invest, to identify the most sophisticated and most effective bidding rules. Okay? So plenty of efficiency advantages to outsourcing this decision. There's, however, a concern, which is that some of these networks who are doing the bidding for advertisers have competitors as clients. So for example, one of them has as clients Dell, Samsung, Apple, and the like. Well, all those companies are submitting bids for similar keyword auctions. And now you have one firm that's setting the bids for all of them. The potential for anti-competitive harm is clear. And one of the things that's done in this paper is to show that there is anti-competitive harm. So here we have these issues, which is, well, if we have an efficiency basis for a third party to handle the pricing decision, but then there's a potential for harm when that third party does so for competitors in a market. What should be the appropriate, current implications of competition law? That will vary with jurisdiction. What should really be the appropriate competition law? And finally, let me turn to the issue of outsourcing of pricing algorithms. So here the idea is that the data is going to stay within the firm, as opposed to what we just looked at, where if you delegate the pricing decision, your data goes outside the firm. It stays within the firm, but you're going to have a third-party software developer provide the pricing algorithm that you're going to use. Okay. Again, there's efficiency basis for that. That third-party developer, well, it makes sense for them to put in more resources, for example, to develop better pricing algorithms, because if they come up with a better algorithm, they can sell to many companies. And so we want to ask the following question to understand the implications of that for market outcomes. How do the design incentives of a firm, which is to sell the algorithm, differ from the design incentives of a firm, which is to use the algorithm, okay, which is what we're used to? And there's a fundamental reason why they're apt to have different incentives, which is that the firm that's developing the pricing algorithm is going to realize that its algorithm might compete against itself. That is, competitors in a market might adopt its pricing algorithm. And if that's a possibility, you would think that one of the things it doesn't want to do is make that pricing algorithm too aggressive, too competitive, because then if competitors in a market adopt it, it's going to have low performance, low profits, and that'll reduce the sales of the pricing algorithm. And in fact, this concern has been expressed by a number of competition authorities. The UK CMA has said that if a sufficiently large proportion of an industry uses a single algorithm to set prices, this could result in the ability and incentive to increase prices. And the OECD has remarked, concerns of coordination would arise if firms outsource the creation of algorithms to the same IT companies and programmers. Okay, so it is a concern that's out there. And we have to also think about, well, if it does have a potential anti-competitive harm, what are really the rights and responsibilities of a third-party developer? Now, there's very little research on this, but this is a topic which I have started to do some work on, so I can kind of give you some initial insight into the problem, and you'll see that what the consequences are of a third-party developer are actually quite subtle. So this is done in the context of a pricing algorithm which is able to respond to high-frequency demand shocks. That's what the third party can deliver for the firm. And we want to think about the third party designing the pricing algorithm to maximize its expected profits. And that depends obviously on enhancing the sale of the pricing algorithm. So what it wants to do, it wants to maximize the incremental value of adoption for a firm. Okay? And one of the implications of that can be shown is that it makes adoptions what's called strategic complements, which means that the value of adopting it to a firm in a market is higher when other firms adopt it. That proves to be a property of the profit maximizing algorithm designed by the third party. Now, if you're designing a pricing algorithm, which is promoting multiple firms in a market to adopt, you might think about wanting to, for example, say, well, what about using the monopoly price function? Because that's going to maximize their joint profits. And indeed, that will lead to the highest profits given everyone else in the market is adopting the pricing algorithm. But here's the problem. It also makes it very attractive not to adopt, given rival firms have adopted it. Because if other firms have adopted this monopoly price function, they're going to be pricing at a relatively high level. It's going to be attractive to you not to adopt the pricing algorithm, so you can take advantage of that. Now, you won't be able to have price being sensitive to high frequency demand shocks, but offsetting that is the fact that you will be facing a bunch of high price rivals. So then this raises a design challenge for a third-party developer, which is how do you make the pricing algorithm profitable to adopt without making it exploitable by a firm that does not adopt? And within the context of the model that I've examined, what you want to do is make the pricing algorithm respond to demand shocks like a monopolist, but with a lower average price. And to be clear on that, here we have the demand shocks. Here we have price. This green curve is the monopoly price function. The demand is stronger, the price is higher. This red line is the outsourced pricing algorithm, what a third-party developer would design. And it has the same slope as the monopoly price function, because that actually is going to serve to really make it attractive for a firm to adopt it, given other firms adopt it, because it's going to be responding to demand shocks like a monopolist. On the other hand, it's shifted down. And it's shifted down so as to not to raise the average price, so as not to make it attractive to a firm not to adopt, given rivals have adopted. The last implication I'll point out here is this somewhat blue line is what a firm would develop on its own rather than than the third party. And you can see it's just a rotation of what the third party develops. And in particular, the slope is flatter, which means the third party makes price more sensitive to the demand shock. And that's because it's making it act like a monopolist in how it responds to the demand shock. So what the implications are is that from this, at least this model, is that average price is not higher from a pricing algorithm developed by a third party, but price is more variable, and that actually has harm for consumers. So just to conclude, we know that algorithmic pricing has a number of efficiencies. We're now in the midst of trying to understand what are the implications for competition and consumer welfare. And associated with that, we want to think about, to what extent competition law is kind of designed to handle them, or whether it has to be modified to deal with some of these challenges. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm most impressed by that great overview. Very profound, but thank you also for making it quite accessible for legal people who do not have the same economic background as you do. Wow, that was really much valuable content. And also, thank you for keeping time so well. I wish I would be able to do that in my presentations. I think, I stop short and reserve all remarks for the Q&A session. Just to say one more thing, I personally am very much looking forward to your future research on algo outsourcing. This is really very important stuff also regarding, of course, the hub and spoke competition law infringement discussion in the EU and the case law we have seen on that so far, and also the papers from the competition agencies dealing with these topics. So I think that would be really very fruitful, together, of course, with the interesting research from your colleagues that you have been explaining to us. So thank you very much, and we are now turning to Giacomo, who will also continue the thread of algorithmic pricing, but with a particular focus on collusion and artificial intelligence. Giacomo, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Very good, thanks. So thanks a lot, Peter and Adrian, for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be with you today, and I'm really honored after these two great presentations by Cristo and Joe. So what I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to present some of the work I've done with colleagues, and an overview of also what has been done from others more recently on the topic that we are discussing. So algorithmic pricing artificial intelligence and the impact on the intensity of competition. So I think at this point I don't really need to spend time to convince you that pricing algorithms is an important phenomenon nowadays, and it's going to last for sure. And it has already been discussed and presented some of the novelties that we have seen with the new type of algorithms. So we went from expert systems to more modern self-learning algorithms. And as Joe has clearly mentioned, pricing algorithms are a source of efficiency, that's for sure. And at the same time of concern. I want to emphasize this point because part of my research has been on about showing some problems that may arise on pricing algorithms, from pricing algorithms, but I want to make it clear that I have a clear view on the benefits that these algorithms can bring. And when I speak with my students and I talk about the benefits of artificial intelligence and the risks that artificial intelligence can bring to market functioning, I make the example of electricity. When electricity was to some discovery and the possible application, it was clear that it was dangerous, but we didn't think about banning electricity because it was dangerous for humans. So the plan of my presentation is going to be, I'm going to discuss a little bit about experiments that I've been conducting with some colleagues. I'm still working on this. Some empirical analysis that is related to this research, and I would really like to somehow open the door for policy discussion later on in our Q&A session. So I will spend some time on, let's say, more policy discussion rather than implications. So quickly, what type of algorithms I will focus? I'm going to focus on new type of algorithm. So as both Joe and Christo mentioned, algorithms are not a new object for pricing. Airlines, hotels, but also financial markets are using algorithms since decades. So the novelty I want to emphasize here is going from algorithms that were used in the past in the class of expert systems that as an economist, I am certainly be very somehow imprecise. I would describe as a set of fixed rules, possibly also very complicated fixed rules, but where the behavior of the algorithm has been already pre-specified by the one who coded the algorithm. So we went from that to what I'm going to focus, which is more advanced algorithms where the coder just specifies few elements in the algorithms, and the algorithm then autonomously learn from experience. So the element is going to be, what is the aim of the algorithm? So we're talking about pricing algorithms. So the aim is going to be the profit to maximize. What data to monitor, for example, prices, or of course on price, but also prices of rivals and inventories also of rivals. And how to then, the third point is how to explore the environment. So these are the three elements that you would observe in this modern type of algorithm. So as I said, then the algorithms through experience and by interacting with the environment is going to learn autonomously how to behave. In the jargon of economists, it's going to autonomously learn the strategy. So as I said, this is the presentation is related to some papers I've been writing with some co-authors that I want to mention: Emilio Calvano, Vincenzo De Nicolò, Sergio Pastorello, and Joe as well. We have a joint paper, which is something I'm going to discuss later on. So the approach that we have taken in this series of papers is based on simulations. So let me tell you what I mean with that. Essentially, we construct virtual environments, and then we populate environments with consumers, with firms, which are gonna be represented by algorithms, and then we study the behavior of these algorithms, of these autonomously learning algorithms. So the idea of using simulations, there are pros and cons in this approach for analysis. The pros is that all elements are under control for us. So we could design the elements of the economic environment and also the characteristics of the algorithms. So you think about the great work that Cristo did and discussed before, which, by the way, was one of the inspiring work on which we relied when we started to work on our research. So thank you, Cristo. So if you think, so the difficulty there was in Cristo's work was identifying which sellers were actually using algorithms and looking at the properties. If you do simulations, you solve those issues because you are designing everything, you are controlling everything, you know how sellers are behaving, what type of algorithms are using, etc., etc. So this is a pros, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. The cons is that if you want to be convincing of the result, you must be really realistic on the markets that you are designing, this virtual market, and also on the algorithms that they're using. So the approach that we have used is running numerous experiments in what we think are realistic environments in terms of markets with buyers and sellers. Sellers are actually algorithms. And our algorithms that use, in particular, one technique, which is reinforcement learning, which is one of the key algorithms in unsupervised learning in artificial intelligence nowadays. I'll say a few words more on this. Then the algorithms, we let the algorithms learn autonomously their strategies, and then we look at what they actually have learned. So we, in a sense, we open the black box of the algorithm and look inside to see what the algorithms have autonomously learned. So the type of algorithms that we're going to use is, as I said, reinforcement learning, in particular, Q-learning. So let me spend just a few minutes in telling what this is about. So imagine that an algorithm that is given the objective to maximize the expected discounted present value of the future stream of profits, as a good manager would actually do. Then the algorithm does in any period the following three things. First, it chooses the price to set with some randomization. So with a given probability, the algorithm decides to charge a price which is, according to the available information that the algorithm has, is the profit maximizing price. This is in the computer science literature jargon is called exploitation, and with complementary probability instead, the algorithm decides to really randomize over all possible prices in order to explore, and this is the exploration part of the algorithm. And you can imagine that there is a trade-off between exploration and exploitation, because with exploitation you get higher profits given current information. With exploration you get information from how the market, how the environment reacts. So in fact, the algorithms learn from experience, observing own realized profits, observing competitors' prices. Then the algorithm stores this information and the loop repeats with the new period. So if you think, it's a very simple trial and error way of learning. There are different ways of learning. Humans also use this approach, in some cases, trial and error. Now, results, let me jump into the result. This is an example of some of our algorithms, the prices that they're setting. This is actually a price distribution, so the frequency of the different prices that are used by our algorithms. Here you see the competitive price, what would be in this simulation, the monopolist price in this case would be here. So you immediately see that what the algorithm have learned to do is to charge significantly high price, certainly moved away from the competitive price and close to the monopolist price, okay? And so the question was, since algorithms are pricing high, why don't they just learn in some clever way to undercut rivals and steal consumers, which would a good manager would do in the end? So there are two possibilities. One possibility is that these algorithms have failed to learn, or they've learned to do something else. If they fail to learn, then it's not a big deal, because there will be at some point either a clever manager or a clever algorithm who will exploit these high prices. So then we try to answer this question. What's happening here with these high prices? So the first approach we took was let's look inside the algorithms, because looking inside the algorithms in principle shows you the strategy that the algorithms have autonomously learned. And the strategies are mapping from what the algorithms observe into the prices, okay? And I'll come back on this property of algorithms. So this was our, in a sense, first attempt. Looking inside algorithms, it's a mess. It's even if our algorithms were in a sense simple objects with respect to what could be used, where computer science could implement. I'll come back later on more complicated algorithms. Still, there is a problem, which is a fairly known problem in computer science, which is explainability. Artificial intelligence sometimes fail to be explainable to us humans. And that was our first problem. We were not able to understand what was going on. Then we took a different approach and applied some economics. And here we discovered something interesting. So what you see here is a graph where we took two algorithms that were learning together. So they had time to autonomously learn and discover their strategies. Okay, so they had some time. And then what we did was the following. What you see here on the horizontal line is time, and on the vertical axis is price. And what you see here is the price that these two algorithms, red and blue, sorry, have learned to charge through repeated interaction. Okay, so I say quite life because they are quite close to the monopolist price and way above the competitive price. So then what we did was the following exercise. We took one of the two algorithms, the red one, and we forced it to drop its price significantly for just one period. You see the blue algorithms is taken by surprise. It doesn't expect this drop. So it continues to charge high price. So the interesting part then is to see what happens next. And what happens next is something interesting. And it's what you see here. The blue algorithm that was taken initially by surprise drops its price dramatically and significantly. And it's also interesting to notice that the red algorithm somehow anticipates this price drop and itself reduces its price. Notice now that the red algorithm at this point is free to do what it wants. No, it's just in the first period that we force it to drop its price. Now it's free, and to some extent anticipating the blue drop, then it also reduces. Then we see what happens in later periods. They stay at low price for some periods, and then they go back, they revert to pre-shock high prices. So the punchline here, what we discovered was using some economics, which is this perturbation or auditing, speaking to Christo's discussion, we were interfering in the life of the algorithm, and we discovered that the reward high prices. If their rivals charge high prices, I do charge high price. They punish price drops, and they forgive in case of price wars, because they go back to pre-shock prices. And so if you want to look at what happens in profits in this exercise, well, our guy, the red, gets an immediate increase in profits. But then, after the blue algorithm responds with the punishment, the drop of our guy, profit of our guy very much reduces. And if you calculate the profit increase that you get here and the profit reduction with respect to the baseline that the algorithm is wasting in this case here, you always notice that price cuts are never profitable. So these algorithms have learned collusive strategies autonomously and tacitly, because they are not communicated. They have no means of communication, of course, except through prices. So Then the analysis, we went on with the analysis, and we did some exploration of the robustness of these results. We discovered that we looked at how algorithms respond to being market populated with other algorithms, more firms, product differentiation, asymmetry. Recently, we have a paper on uncertainty, entry and exit, inventories. So the punchline is that this algorithm responds in a very reasonable way, in a sense, very close to what economic theory would tell us they should do. We complexify the environment, giving them more choices, longer memory, mixing hyperparameters, a more complex environment. Again, the results are robust to these variations. And I want also to mention that there were some replications by the other researchers in similar environments, for example, with sequential price timing. Timo Klein has a paper on this, the results are there. More recently, a paper with deep learning, which is a sophisticated version of what we were using. Results are there, and other related learning strategies are confirming. So overall, stubborn and robust tendency to learn collusive strategies. That was our discovery. Now, I want to spend a few words now on empirical analysis, because as I said, simulations are convincing to the extent that they are realistic. And then we, at some point, need empirical check of what we are doing. So that is an empirical investigation based on actual behavior in markets. And the pro of this is going from, to what extent, what we think is our own experimental analysis, which is a proof of concept, to actual proof in real markets. The cons of empirical analysis with respect to what we did with the experiments is that, as Christo was mentioning, you have an indirect identification of the sellers who are using algorithms, and you can do limited comparative statics because the world is what it is. You cannot change the parameters of the world easily. So for this, I'm going to say a few words coming from a paper by Assad and others. Some of the authors are at the Toulouse School of Economics. So what these authors have done, they studied algorithmic pricing in the German retail gasoline market. The idea, so they noticed that since 2017, a software company which was actually the company that was mentioned in Joe's presentation at the beginning, announced their ability to supply these retail gasoline chains to offer them pricing algorithms powered by artificial intelligence. You see, probably not very clearly, the adoption of the gas stations of the different chains, and they very much started to adopt after 2017. So the company says that the software rapidly, continuously, and intelligently react to market conditions. And they were actually monitoring other closed stations prices, the traffic condition, the weather, and they were able to adapt to this condition on almost on continuous time. Now, they just want to mention a difficulty in a sense of the empirical approach. You have to, and this author have done a great job in this analysis. You have to cover necessarily two steps. First step, you need to identify which are the sellers, that is the gas station in this case, adopting algorithms, and the moment, the date of adoption. Okay, and this is not an easy task. They are using breaks in frequency or price changes, as both Joe and Christo mentioned before. Then the second step, you want to measure what is the causal effect of algorithmic pricing adoption, comparing those who adopted pricing algorithm with those who didn't adopt. And here, it's not an easy empirical analysis because there may be confounding factors. Think about a gas station that is run by a very clever manager the clever manager adopts the algorithm, but the gas station may be very profitable simply because the manager is clever and independently of the algorithm. So the identification is not an easy task, but as I said, they did really a great job, at least in my view. And I want to mention here a bunch of very interesting results that they've shown. And I'm quite happy to show these results also because you're going to see it's very consistent with the some of the results that we have unveiled with our simulation approach. So first result, so they were able to study adoption at the single gas station level. So if the adopting gas station had no competitors in a radius, in a reasonable radius geographical distance, in terms of geographical distance, so the adoption shows no significant changes on prices. Now, if instead adopters face competition, then the adoption increases prices, not so much, so plus 0.8 cents per liter. But interesting things come when they look at duopoly cases. Of course, duopolies here is defined in terms of a geographical case in which there are two closed stations that are somehow close enough to be really competitors and being somehow separated from the rest of the gas stations. So in the case of duopoly, if just one of them adopts, then there is no so much effect. But if both sellers adopt, then the price cost margin increases by a considerable amount, 38% increase in price cost margin. Undercutting disappears when both stations adopt. And adopters are more likely to respond with price drop to rivals price decrease within 5 minutes. This is reminiscent of punishments. And the above is more so over time when two adopters, so this price response to price cuts takes some time. There is some learning process going on. And the margin increase that was I mentioned at point 4 actually takes quite a bit of time to realize, 1 year. And again, this is related to the fact that learning should require some time, as it is the case in our experiments. And as I said, these are interesting and very consistent outcomes and results with our experimental analysis. So, so I think I will be quick here on pricing algorithms and concerns, because already this has already been covered with very much clarity by Joe. So what I want to tell you then is, in the last 5 minutes, something about policy approaches. So the idea here, well, we have many options. So we have seen that there are issues, some concerns on pricing algorithms, and the reactions could be, well, it's not a big problem. And we could think that a laissez-faire approach is the right probably approach if the risk of what we are seeing, the problems that we have seen is low. On the other hand, if we think that the risk is very high, then an ex-ante approach, similar more to regulation, probably is the right way to go. And in between, if the risk is moderate, we may think about an ex-post approach like antitrust or consumer protection. Again, I'm really cutting here a very complex issue in a very simple way, just to give some thought for discussion later on. So, what about market reaction? As Joe mentioned, we may ask whether a platform that observes price increase due to pricing algorithm may want to react. And this is there is this important contribution by Justin Johnson and co-authors. Another possible market reaction has been proposed by Michael Gall, who I see in the group of in the audience. And the idea is to think about the possibility that consumers organize themselves with algorithms, delegating buying decision to bots. For example, entering or placing orders when the pricing conditions are best. And of course, there may be question to what extent firms and sellers in general, those who adopt these pricing algorithms, may want to react to this observation of potentially high prices. So few comments on the ex-ante approach. You may think about having a systematic pre-approval of algorithms and along the lines of the pre-approval process that we are using for drugs, where we somehow balance benefits with potential risks. Now, this is an interesting approach. The problem I see with this approach is going to be a very really daunting task, because computer scientists are very creative and very efficient in providing new type of algorithms, variants, and we would have to check these variants of algorithms very rapidly, so a difficult task. A minimal ex-ante approach that I'm suggesting here would be somehow compulsory and public notification of algorithmic pricing. If you are a seller and you use algorithmic pricing, you should somehow be asked to disclose this and with some details of the type of algorithms. And this is not new. If you look at financial markets, the payment directive in Europe already requires for algorithmic traders that they disclose their use of algorithmic trading strategies. And another important, let's say, that I classify in the approach that I classify in the ex-ante approach is the possibility to think about a digital authority with a mandate to somehow develop target regulation, or at least screen market. And this has been advocated in many reports that we have seen in the last year on digital markets, and recently also by the new proposal on artificial intelligence that is quite recent, April this year, by the European Commission. So what about the ex-post approach? So I think I'm going to be, again, quick here. We know that the current legal doctrine, well, actually, you are teaching me that the current legal doctrine is rooted in conspiracy. And so, of course, the problem is high prices. With collusion, the problem is high prices. But currently, the illegality of collusion is in the process that generates the ability to collude on high prices. And this is for good reason. So, of course, I will not enter into details here. But this is the current state of the legal doctrine, at least the way I see. Now, but in this case, then tacit collusion by algorithms could be, in a sense, lawful, unless there is a change in attitude towards the behavior of these algorithms. So how to improve from here? Now, there are different approaches. We can decide that some price level are too high, and we may think about considering the possibility of assessing this on the basis of the notion of excessive pricing. I'm personally not very keen on this, and I think again, this is going to be very similar to regulation, at least to me. And you need a lot of information and time to do this type of assessment of prices. Can we claim that algorithms have an intent of collusion? Well, I think that's the slippery slope, because then you have to start seeing algorithms as conscious machines, and well, there is discussion on this, sure, but I see some difficulties at least. And but there is an interesting difference between humans and algorithms that I want to comment here and exploit. And this is related to a research that I've done with my co-authors and also with Joe. So, and then I'll conclude. So the important difference is that if you think about humans colluding, well, as I said, communication is a very important element. So communication with human collusion is present and discoverable. And instead, what is problematic with humans is that the collusive pricing rules or strategies, it's latent and non-discoverable. You cannot go to a human manager and ask to see what was the strategies to support high collusive prices. The manager would simply tell you, well, I was not colluding, so there is nothing to disclose. Now, if you look at algorithms instead, communication is not present, and this is the problem of tacit collusion. But then collusive pricing rules and strategies is to some extent discoverable. I say to some extent because, as shown you before, there is an issue of explainability, and we have to somehow tweak and audit the algorithm the right way in order to have the behavior of that the algorithm have learned to emerge and observe. So let me just conclude with just throwing the ball probably to Cristo. There are two important elements that we can take from the computer science discussion on artificial intelligence, what I think it's very interesting. The first I already mentioned is the explainability of artificial intelligence in general, but in this case of algorithmic pricing. And here is the computer science world is debating on how to make artificial intelligence explainable. There are different approaches, transparent by design, post-hoc explainability, so that ex post we want to be able to interpret the behavior of the algorithm, why the algorithm took some decisions rather than other. So the question there is, what is the best for markets? What is the right form of explainability for markets? And another element I want to take from computer science, and now I really conclude, is the notion of fairness. So computer scientists, and also to some extent economists in other environments, have already observed the risk of unfair behavior of algorithms. There are interesting works by economists, and this is my field, of course, showing some unfair decisions in the environment of credits and loans, on decision on loans. Now, computer scientists have discussed for quite a bit of time about the general principles that could be used to deal with fairness, for example, accountability, responsibility, awareness of the function of the algorithm, competence of AI adopters, and human oversight. So there are different approaches again here. Design algorithms that should be fair by design. Now the question is, can we apply this notion of fairness again to pricing algorithms in order to limit this tendency I was mentioning before on collusion? And that's really all what I wanted to tell for now. Thanks a lot.
So thank you very much, Giacomo, for this wonderful presentation. I'm taking over here from Peter, and I would like to thank you to all three panelists for providing us with such really generative, clear, and absolutely enlightening ideas that certainly push us to think in ways that we're really not usually accustomed to thinking. So I think also the presentations show to us how important it is to address issues around competition and digital markets from a multitude of different perspectives to kind of enrich legal analysis and to inform and devise sound policy proposals. Now, so all of your presentations were incredibly rich and raised so many interesting issues that we can hardly discuss all of them or do justice to all of them within the remaining time, but perhaps we can pick some of the most urgent policy issues that emerge and then try to put them into context. And I try to make my remarks as brief as possible. I see at least, and I say at least because I'm oversimplifying, because again, I cannot do justice to all of the facets of your presentations, but I see at least three broad scenarios that could possibly be covered by the scope of the provisions that we have in competition law. And one scenario covers a situation which I think was mainly described by Joe in the second presentation, in which competing undertakings are supplied with identical or similar software by a third party, or where pricing mechanisms are outsourced to a third party. So generally speaking, we would have an issue from a policy perspective or from a legal perspective if the commercial policies of the parties coincide somehow through the parallel use of the same algorithmic code or the same training data pool without any direct interaction between them. And so if we look at the existing case law, this may, in some circumstances, amount to tacit collusion, but this would probably depend on the undertaking's awareness of their sharing the same technology and their attitude towards the competitive risks that such sharing entails. So we would most probably have to assess such a scenario by a case-by-case basis according to objective and consistent evidence. A second scenario, which would probably cause us even more of a headache, is the scenario described by Giacomo, where we have a mere interaction by algorithms in the absence of any human intervention, such as when competing algorithms or competing firms use machine learning algorithms. So if only computers communicate or simply react to each other on their own to achieve some sort of a predetermined business goal, I think we would have to first solve or answer two very fundamental issues, two very fundamental questions. The first would be, do we, and you alluded to this in your presentation, do we have to or should we attribute liability to such a scenario? Should we do so? And if so, how do we collect the evidence resulting from such a scenario? And just very briefly with respect to the first remark, because you said yourself that this is not entirely clear. Should we attribute liability to such a scenario? If we look at the pertinent case law, I think we might be inclined to say yes. The Court of Justice of the European Union, in a very important 1972 decision, stated that the object of competition is to prohibit any form of coordination which knowingly substitutes practical cooperation between undertakings for the risks of competition. So if the companies know that the employment of self-learning algorithms will reduce somehow the entrepreneurial risks associated with competition, or will reduce or even eliminate their economic independence in arriving at their pricing decisions, then this might result in an anti-competitive practice. But of course, this is very unclear. And then there is a third cluster of issues mentioned by Christo in Christo's presentation. Algorithms may be used to establish dominance when they influence consumer purchasing behavior, when they help undertakings to increase market shares, economies of scale, better forecasting, maximize network effects, and so forth. And maybe even anti-competitive business practices may be facilitated by AI software. So we have case law already that looks at the leveraging of dominance into other markets through self-preferencing in ranking algorithms or exploitative abuses that are facilitated through illicit employment of users' data on the platform. And Amazon is a particularly interesting example. Amazon seems to have an advantage secured in the buy box, but as you said, it is unclear why. Is it due to an unfair design, or is it some sort of a cumulative advantage? So here, I think we are left with the main question: if these behaviors or if these scenarios can be somehow anti-competitive as a result, how do we collect in practice evidence in such cases? And I take it from your presentations that we can make distinctions between inputs and outputs. For instance, at the input level, we would think of feeding algorithms with certain data to prevent them from reaching collusive or abusive behavior. At the output level, we would have to think at or look at the algorithm's rules. But as Giacomo said, this is difficult in the case of self-learning algorithms because the rules may not reveal a particular strategy, so we have to test them, audit them, identify those properties that would likely need to be outlawed, and then test the algorithm again so as to have some sort of a counterfactual scenario. Both things could theoretically be done by authorities within an antitrust investigation or when adopting an ex-ante regulatory framework. But we always have to keep in mind that the solutions have to be workable in practice, particularly from the authorities' point of view, also from an IT software programming perspective, from the perspective of algorithm developers. And we also don't have to forget that despite this unclarity, even pricing agreements, so-called hardcore restrictions, may be exempted under efficiency aspects. So I think these questions raise so many important issues and interesting issues. We may really ask whether we can realistically assume, whether we can realistically retrain algorithms so that they, for instance, no longer find collusive outcomes. Will this then still be an attractive algorithm for companies to acquire? Joe mentioned the dilemma that there is with respect to incentives that algorithm developers face. So maybe you have thoughts on these issues because I think they're most pressing from the point of view of the regulator or from the point of view of competition lawyers.
Well, I'll jump in, and also I was glancing at a question in chat which relates to one of the issues, questions you raised, Adrian. You know, as Giacomo had in his slide, collusion is about conspiracy, but what we're seeing here is a lot of instances of supra-competitive pricing and super-competitive outcomes where there's only one agent involved, you know, or there's no agents involved. So it's either either self-learning algorithms or it's a third-party developer. And so we don't have the most fundamental ingredient of a conspiracy, which is there are two or more individuals seeking to create harm. And so this really, I think, you know, we'll see many instances. Another one is, as I mentioned in my talk, was delegating a pricing decision to a third party. So once again, if the firms themselves are doing that delegation or are adopting the self-learning algorithm, or are purchasing the pricing algorithm, are just unaware of the fact that what other firms, competitors are doing, and thus are unaware of the potentially anti-competitive outcomes of their choices, then certainly under current law, it's hard to see them being responsible. And then the question is, to what extent is a third party, when there is a third party, like in the delegation of the pricing decision, the purchasing of a pricing algorithm for a software developer, to what extent are they going to be held liable? I can say in the US, it would be difficult to, certainly the third-party developer to be found liable. You know, maybe they could be prosecuted under unfair act of competition under the FTC Act, but I don't see where they could be prosecuted under the Sherman Act, which is our key piece of legislation, both because number one, there's not a conspiracy. Number two, you can prosecute a agent, a firm, when they have sufficient market power, but there's no presumption there. And furthermore, it's not clear that competition is going to help solve these problems. So for example, it's not clear that competition among software developers will avoid the problem of all the companies competitors in a market adopting the same pricing algorithm, because that might actually prove to be what's most profitable for each of them. So, so I think this is a real challenge, and it's going to require that we, go beyond the notion of conspiracy to really look at the source of super competitive harm. And that's kind of going back to Giacomo's kind of experiments. I mean, that's what it's really getting at. The harm is coming from the pricing rules that are being adopted, not from the communication that forms the conspiracy. That's more from relevant to an evidentiary perspective in terms of prosecuting the case. But I think we're going to have to try to design laws and policies that get at the real source of harm. And what we may also want to think about doing is making these firms liable in the sense of putting a responsibility among them to actually ensure that they're not adopting a pricing algorithm from a third party which is also selling it to competitors. Or if they're delegating their pricing decision to a third party, that it's up to them to ensure that that third party doesn't make that pricing decision in coordination with the price decision of other clients who are their competitors, and so forth. So I mean, I think there are some avenues to pursue, but my sense is that competition law is not very suitable for it.
Yeah, I'll chime in a little bit as well. And I think I agree with Joe. I think we need to reimagine what liability looks like in these areas where you can develop algorithms that appear neutral on their face, but when used in practice can have really really damaging consequences. Time and again, we see tech companies develop technology and make it available, things like identification algorithms or facial recognition, advertising platforms that automatically infer people's demographic attributes, technologies that could be fine, but once they are out there, they're misused, either intentionally or unintentionally. And pinning the blame on anyone or making anyone responsible is very hard under our current laws. So putting some of the burden on the developer to police how their system is being used preemptively, I think is important to kind of changing the incentive structure here.
Can I jump in here? And I would ask, Cristo, you are an expert in auditing. I've seen some of your work that you have done on this. It's really amazing. So I would like to have your opinion about whether you see auditing of these algorithms designed for pricing reasonable, and somehow related to this, whether you see, again, reasonable the idea of having a compulsory notification of algorithmic pricing.
So I think these things are reasonable. I would love to see just blanket transparency requirements. If you're doing dynamic pricing or personalized pricing, or if you're personalizing markets to change the order of items, I think those things should be disclosed. And at a minimum, that just means that consumers are more informed about the markets that they're encountering. And it's extremely useful to people like me. When I'm out there looking for things to study, step one is figuring out, is there even an algorithm here? So then, with respect to deeper audits, I think we've been, pretty successful at showing that this is possible, and there's a wide range of kinds of scenarios we can envision in the future. Maybe we just rely on kind of these third-party audits where someone like me is an outsider. We could imagine deeper regulation that says if you're developing systems in particular kinds of markets, like a pricing algorithm or an algorithm in healthcare or an algorithm for credit scoring, you actually must get your system audited. So you have to have an independent third party come and look at the code, look at the data, try to assess whether there's these different kinds of bias or unfairness. I think these are imminently doable. It's not going to violate anyone's trade secrets. We're not talking about posting source code and data for everyone to see. It looks a lot more like a financial audit, something that's very common, or a cybersecurity audit. Again, very, very common practice now. I think it actually really more revolves around the political will to mandate such a thing, and really sort of nailing down who must be audited, because clearly not every system is as important as every other, and the how of it. Is this just the developer self-certifies that certain criteria are being met, or is there really a mandate that someone look at code and data and really dig in? But I mean, I think all these options are very much on the table.
Thank you. So we have a question from Michel Gall, but before Michel, I give you the floor. Maybe a very brief point from myself. So I totally see why it would be helpful to have that ex-ante auditing kind of thing and transparency rules, but I was wondering, while you speak about how we could make this operational in a global setting where algos are ever more widespread and not employed only by the big guys like the GAFAM undertakings, but also smaller firms. So when you imagine a scenario in which, I don't know, thousands or even tens of thousands of algos are reprogrammed or employed afresh within, say, 1/4 of a year, would be doing this? I mean, you are an eminent scholar in this field, but leaving this to the scientific community only is probably not going to work, and self-certification is probably not going to work, and especially smaller undertakings are probably not in a position to ensure timely and kind of efficient and reliable certification of these things. So I don't know, do we need an agency employing algos which automatically audit algos which are out there in the markets, or how would you make this operational in a real life scenario?
I mean, I think it would be great if there were resources for governments to do this. They're ideally positioned to fund this and remain independent. In practice, though, I suspect what will happen is that there will be an ecosystem of companies that do these kinds of audits. The same way there's an ecosystem of cybersecurity firms that do red team review and penetration testing. We're already starting to see this. Some of the big consulting firms now say they do fairness audits for algorithms. I think that's fine to use a market approach, but we need to be very, very careful to make sure that if we're relying on independent companies or to do this sort of auditing, that the standards for that are very clear. Without standards, I can go out right now and find someone who will audit my algorithm, but it's not at all clear what that means, what I'm buying.
Yeah. I mean, I was also thinking while Giacomo presented possible policy approaches, I was also thinking about ex-ante standard setting for algos. That's something I think, Giacomo, that you haven't been mentioning so much. I mean, that's an idea out there, but I'm not aware. Maybe also Christo, what do you think about that? Whether this is a feasible approach, kind of defining an ex-ante, whatever. I mean, standard. I of course immediately think about like standards for Wi-Fi and 4G and 5G standards, things like that. Probably algo standards are going to be looking differently, but do you think that's a feasible way of approaching these things?
I think it is, because what we ultimately care about are outcomes. So this is not about controlling the kinds of models people use, maybe even not necessarily about controlling the kind of input they use. How you do the thing is not really what's important. What's important is, does it lead to market outcomes that we find problematic? So defining what those outcomes are, what the acceptable tolerances are, that seems to be the challenging part. And then it's getting people to submit to this regime where they must be evaluated to those standards.
Can I add something here? So I started asking Christo about the possibility, feasibility of auditing, which would be, a first step in the sense feasibility of that approach. So Christo, you gave us a positive answer on this possibility. Then the next question is what to audit, in the sense of what do we want that the algorithms are doing or not doing. And here is where probably economists should somehow have a say. And what I've shown you with this picture, which somehow became the flagship of our research, where you see the drop in price, the algorithms vanishing, and then they stay low, and then they go back, etc. So this is a pattern. This is tacit collusion that we really teach in class when we discuss about tacit collusion, and so this is something that we should not want to see in the mapping learned by the algorithms from rivals prices into own prices. But then that's a very simple example. So I would also like to see what Joe's view on this. How us as economists may actually generalize this idea of what's wrong, what we would be able to say to our colleagues in computer science to say that that's wrong.
Yeah, no, it is a challenge, because I mean, you can kind of pose the question, and now, as you said, the question is how do you operationalize it? I guess I probably, if I had to, think of a direction, I think I probably put it more in terms of thinking about constraints on the learning algorithm. Now, of course, in some sense, that just raises again the question that you're posing, Giacomo, which is, if, for example, we put the burden on the firm to test its pricing algorithms for certain properties, what those properties should be. So it's a problem to be solved. And I see your research as kind of the initial step in really a program that will help address it. So
this seems like this seems like there's a fundamental challenge here of, a firm can test their algorithm and find that it's fine in isolation. But when we think about the entire market, all of a sudden we have emergent behavior. That seems like the hardest part about this. Individually fair algorithms are not fair in total necessarily. And bridging that seems like an ideal role for government, actually, to do these kind of bake-offs and make sure that things together, writ large, form a market that's stable.
Well, thank you. This was incredible, really, really wonderful. And I want to also ask about how do you operationalize this? Because it seems to me that the discussion about fair AI or auditing AI, creating a digital unit, and all these must really be based on us knowing what exactly we are prohibiting. Because we do not prohibit oligopolistic coordination. And maybe the reasons are reasons that should not be applicable anymore, because they were related to humans, and now algorithms change this. But do we really know what exactly we are prohibiting? Even if we go to outcomes, what kind of outcomes are we prohibiting? Are we prohibiting every super competitive price, a super competitive price that changes every 5 minutes, or whatever? So I think this is a very, very fundamental question. And this is why, and Joe, you so rightly said, competition law does not work here. However, what I really liked, and I want to have your view on this, is I think that I really love the idea of creating incentives through technology. And so one issue here, or one suggestion was the one made by Johnson to create carrots, but we can also create sticks. Giacomo, when I look at your graph, I see why not require them every, half an hour to go down, every day to go down once, because you forced it. Maybe we should force it through regulation. Or, I think the technology here might be the solution.
Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I'll just say kind of two things. One is, in some of these instances, for example, delegating pricing and then what the platform does, we could put restrictions in terms of what the objective is, because often these pricing algorithms, they do, particularly a self-learning algorithm for sure, but even short of that, they have an objective. If the objective of the pricing algorithm, so it's designed to, for example, choose prices, whatever the action is, to maximize some sort of joint, for example, profit or some sort of joint outcome for the suppliers, sellers involved, then that's something which is of concern, because we know that's something that competition does not produce. And we know that this kind of joint optimization generally, there are some exceptions, but generally leads to bad outcomes for society. So that'd be one thing. What is the actual objective, of the algorithm as designed by the third party, platform or outside developer? And the other one, in terms of going back to the algorithmic collusion, my view is that collusion is a contractual arrangement. It's an informal contract, which basically says, I'm going to keep my price high as long as you do, and if you don't, then I'm going to impose a penalty on you of some form, which can take the form of me lowering my price. And that's to me, what we should be aiming for when we think about what do we want to prohibit? You know, that type of kind of implicit contractual arrangement, you know, which if we wrote it down on a piece of paper, the firms, it would clearly be illegal and it wouldn't be enforceable. And so now that's what is implicitly getting embedded in these types of algorithms as in Giacomo's work. Now, once again, I think that's kind of in principle well-defined. Operationalizing it is what the challenge is. You know, we can, in our simple models, we know how to operationalize it. In more realistic models where there's lots of variables changing in the environment, then it becomes the challenge.
Yeah, take this. It's very interesting because this relates to a remark that Giacomo made in the presentation. To me, it occurred that it's perhaps not surprising when we look at self-learning algorithms that if they are really intelligent, that they're designed to collude, because this is the rational strategy to pursue. Surprising here is rather the fact that algorithms do in fact behave like humans in the end. And so we might also draw, when we think about how such regulation or such an approach could look like, we could draw from insights that we gain from human collusion. So for instance, from a software programming perspective or from a legal perspective, we could introduce some noise or reduce market transparency or introduce delay by law for machine learning algorithms if we are concerned about collusion. So in the same way that we provide seatbelts in cars, for instance, so that a quick response is impossible. What about solutions such as these? Would they make sense from an economic or from an IT point of view?
From an economic point of view, so we have to pay attention because there are immediately trade-offs. So all these, for example, these approaches on explainability, on fairness, they are putting constraints to the algorithms, and they reduce the ability to perform their task at their best. So we really have to balance here the issue of constraining what they are, what would be free to do, and being happy with the outcome of what they do. I think that's something that should be explored, but I see a trade-off. So sooner or later we will have to address a trade-off here. Maybe this is the one, but we have to do with some care for sure.
I mean, if I may step in here and you know, concur a little bit with what you just said, Giacomo. So listening to this most interesting workshop so far, that I found that there is a streak of kind of making or that we seem to feel the need to make market algos more stupid than they actually are. We seem to feel the need to, you know, disturb the strategies they would pursue in the interest of the businesses employing them. We feel the need to make the hurdles for employing such tools very high, you know, by auditing obligations and transparency obligations and so on. And we then, you know, we ask firms to build malfunctions into their algorithms. We may ask firms to artificially, you know, introduce regular price drops and stuff. This is a very substantial amount of engineering that kind of distorts the optimal working of these algo tools. Of course, I understand where it all comes from, and probably we need some sort of intervention. But then again, you know, we in a way we make algos function worse than they otherwise would in order to arrive at an outcome that we consider to be a competitive one, because it is the outcome generated by humans, which in certain ways function much worse than algos when they interact on markets, right? Algos can arrive at stable, super competitive price levels without communicating. Humans can't do that. I think that also your research, Giacomo, and the research of others has shown that algos are able to collude in multiplayer settings in which humans wouldn't be able to collude because it just gets too complicated, right? So we kind of try to cut back algos to a level of malfunctioning that compares them to humans in order to arrive at a competitive situation we kind of feel comfortable with because it's been comfortable. It's what we have been traditionally considering as competition. This is very, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. If we do not feel easy with all of that, can't we, hope or expect that in the long run, if we choose more of a laissez-faire approach, that markets, even employing algorithmic tools, kind of re-establish a competitive equilibrium or some sort of competitive situation, right? So Giacomo, you showed us those two algorithms running against each other, and then the price drop, and then they arrived again at the super competitive price level. So those are two, right? But imagining thousands of players in the market, wouldn't there maybe be strategies that kind of try to deviate from those equilibria in order to seek their niche, right? And do we maybe by making the hurdles for employing algorithms so high that only the GAFAMs do actually do all this auditing and employ the really powerful ones, do we maybe prevent such niche strategies? So I'm throwing a bunch of confrontative views and questions at you, but that was something that that's been in my mind.
Well, let me say this: there's a lot there, Peter. But so let me just comment on one aspect, which is it's not. I don't think it's right to characterize it as trying to make them closer to humans and avoid problems. For example, the issue of tacit collusion, with so it's coordinating on higher prices without communication. We know that occurs in practice with humans. We just don't know, but we don't know how to prosecute it in a way that doesn't chill competition. And I think it's very important, we don't think it's that common, that it does occur. And so we accept it. Now, when we look at algorithmic collusion, okay, it's just like that, so to speak, but we potentially have a way in which to deal with it that we don't have with humans. Okay, so there the problem is kind of different. It's kind of and then I think you're right, and I think as well. And Giacomo put this this point there about putting constraints and that can disrupt the efficiencies that the algorithms kind of deliver. So we do indeed have to be kind of very careful in this regard. But maybe it comes down to is we don't feel like we have the invisible hand in this world with algorithms, whereby we feel like competition is necessarily going to take care of the problems. I'm not convinced of that, and nor am I convinced of that existing competition law is suitable for it. So.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, you definitely present us with a conundrum, right? Demanding all this work be done to neuter the machines, but I think it is justified. So I think of this in terms of asymmetry. There's a computational power asymmetry between individuals and firms. There's also an information asymmetry. The amount of data required to make these decisions is easily accessible to firms, not at all accessible to individuals. And so that requires remedy to limit the impact of that asymmetry, at least with respect to individual people versus firms. We don't know what's being our data is being collected. We don't know what it's being used for. We don't know if algorithms are at play. We don't know what they're doing. And so shifting the burden onto consumers to level the playing field themselves is infeasible, which means we need market intervention.
Well, Peter, I mean, I think this is a great conversation. Unfortunately, I have to leave. I have another obligation. It's actually 11:15 in the morning here. My day is still going on.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a very good point. So we are losing ourselves in this very interesting discussion. I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much to the speakers, also to the audience, for this most interesting workshop session. I learned a lot, really. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope to see you again, the speakers and also the audience, for our next session in the workshop series, which will be in fall and which will be on consumer impact of algorithmic market activity. And one of our speakers is going to be Michelle Gall. And so we're looking very much forward to this. Thank you all so much. Stay with us with CIPCO and ASCOLA, and have a great day or afternoon or evening from wherever you're watching. Thank you so much.